Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the final episode in the Albert Pierrepoint series. The abolition of the death penalty in Britain came about gradually over many years of campaigning, controversies and setbacks. Throughout its history, there were changes made to how executions were carried out and who should be sent to the noose, all the while garnering supporters and detractors. Join me as I delve into how the death penalty came to an end and review the final execution. For Albert Pierrepoint, who had spent 25 years carrying out executions, he had a front row seat to the changing climate. In his time he had hanged the infamous and unfortunately the innocent, and by the end of his career Albert's views on the death penalty had been shaped. He admitted that during the 25 years he had, quote, believed with all my heart that I was carrying out a public duty. I conducted each execution with great care and a clear conscience. In his autobiography, Executioner Pierrepoint, Albert reflected on the impact the death penalty had on criminality, concluding that he, quote, sincerely hopes that no man is ever called upon to carry out another execution in my country. I have come to the conclusion that executions solve nothing, and are only an antiquated relic of a primitive desire for revenge, which takes the easy way and hands responsibility for revenge to other people. He continues by stating that he disagrees with the idea that capital punishment acted as a deterrent. There have been many murders since the beginning of time, and we shall go on looking for deterrents until the end of time. Recalling the impact his role had, he lamented, all the men and women who I faced at that final moment convince me that in what I have done I have not prevented a single murder. Albert would become one of many who supported the abolition of the death penalty, but for all its detractors, there were also its supporters, causing debates that continue to this day. Yet the journey to its abolition was a long one, and although there are calls to reinstate the punishment from some, does the death penalty truly have a place in modern society? Or was Albert Pierrepoint right in his assertion that it is a form of revenge, not a deterrent? Throughout its history, the death penalty has seen many changes. People were once burned at the stake, although even this method saw reform. Prior to 1652, an individual would be alive when the fire was started. Yet in 1789, when Catherine Murphy became the last person to be burned at the stake, it had become customary for the condemned to be strangled prior to burning, and the practice was abolished in June 1790. Being hanged, drawn and quartered was another brutal method of execution, which was reserved primarily for those who committed treason. The last person to die by this method was Edward Marcus Despard in 1803, although there were others who would be sentenced to the same fate, but would be punished by alternate means, with this form of execution being officially discarded in 1870. The method of hanging also evolved over time, from the guilty party being hanged from the branch of a tree, to the construction of gallows and the development of scaffolds, with a drop through a trapdoor being introduced in 1793. Each incarnation aimed to bring about a swifter and more humane method of death. However, this was not always the case, and there are numerous occasions where the condemned suffered a slow and painful death when their neck was not broken by the drop, resulting in them being strangled by the noose. Aside from the botched hangings, another aspect that removed all humanity from the act of execution was the fact that before 1868 it was a public spectacle. The original intention for allowing the public to view an execution was to act as a warning to others, that if they committed a capital crime, this would be their fate. Yet it had become increasingly clear that far from serving as a deterrent, these events were being treated as a form of entertainment. In acknowledgement that public executions served no moral purpose, it was deemed that all sentences would be conducted in private, with the last public execution taking place on the 26th of May 1868 at Newgate Prison, where Michael Barrett was hanged for his part in the Clerkenwell explosion. Michael was a member of the Fenians, an organisation opposed to British rule in Ireland, and in November 1867, when O'Sullivan Burke, a member of the organisation, was arrested and held at Clerkenwell Prison in London, a plot was devised to free him. The plan was to place a bomb by the walls of the prison, with the intention that the ensuing explosion would facilitate Burke's escape. Unfortunately, as well as destroying the wall, the blast also damaged a tenement building located opposite, causing the deaths of 12 people and injuring 120. 27-year-old Michael Barrett would subsequently be found guilty of the crime, leading to him being hanged on Tuesday the 26th of May 1868, in the presence of 2,000 people, who expressed their disdain by berating the condemned man as he made his way up to the scaffold. The moment of his death was met with silence, followed by the crowd, some who had gathered since the previous night, disbanding, having bore witness to the final public execution. Following Michael Barrett's demise, all hangings would take place within the prison, away from the public, in much more solemn surroundings, with only a select number of representatives from the press, the victim's family, and prison officials in attendance. In later years, only prison officials and the executioner would be authorised to attend. The first private execution took place on the 14th of August 1868 at Maidstone Jail, with the convicted man being 18-year-old Thomas Wells, who had shot his manager, Edward Walsh, after being reprimanded for his poor performance at work. Wells' defence would argue that he had previously been involved in an accident during which the defendant was almost crushed by a train, causing a change in the 18-year-old's mental state, meaning he was not of sound mind at the time of the murder. However, this defence failed to sway the jury, who deliberated for just 5 minutes before delivering the guilty verdict. He would meet his end at the hands of hangman William Calcraft, but his death was far from swift. As the executioner released the trapdoor, the length of rope was not calculated to ensure that the condemned man's neck would break during the drop, and as such it would take approximately 2 minutes for death to occur from strangulation. Following his death, the customary black flag was raised and a notice of execution placed at the prison gate. However, there was very little interest from the public, who, excluded from witnessing the hanging, went about their lives unaffected, with the thoughts of abolition not yet at the forefront of their minds. As well as reforms in how the death penalty was carried out, the 19th century would also see amendments to the crimes that were deemed capital offences. Initially, there were over 200 acts that were punishable by death, yet the introduction of an official police force, prison reforms, and the use of penal colonies meant that most offences were now being commuted to prison terms. This was in part thanks to the 1823 Death Sentence Act, which allowed judges to hand out more lenient sentences. By 1861, there were only 5 crimes considered serious enough to be punished by death. These offences were piracy with violence, acts of arson in royal dockyards, treason, espionage, and murder. 13 years after the reduction of the number of capital crimes, a new form of hanging would be tested by executioner William Marwood. The long drop had been a technique that had been used in Ireland since 1853, and Marwood hoped to normalise its use in England. The new method utilised the weight and height of the condemned in order to determine the length of rope required for a swift death. This led to the introduction of the table of drops in the 1890s, which acted as a guide for all future executioners. The perceived humane ending this new form of execution offered led to it being the standard method which would be utilised until the abolition of the death penalty. And with the standardised format came another change. Prior to 1884, there was no set design for the gallows, resulting in various types, some of which were transported from one jail to the next, depending where a hanging was taking place. This lack of consistency and the dismantling and reassembling of the gallows led to problems. Sometimes the trapdoors would fail, or the drop would be insufficient. And so a set of gallows were developed, which would become the standard wherever an execution was held. The transportation of the scaffold was also ended, with a development of the execution chamber housed within the prison, where the new gallows would be permanently located, reducing the risk of damage to the structure and ensuring that each chosen location had its own set. As the century came to a close, emphasis was placed on a convict's psychological state, leading to the introduction of the Criminal Lunatic Act in 1884. This stipulated that the Home Secretary would have to consult with 2 qualified medical professionals regarding the mental state of an individual condemned to death, and if the person was determined to be insane, they would not hang. A further change would come 4 years later, when it was determined that there should be 3 clear Sundays between the time of sentencing to the date of execution, and no sentence was to be carried out on a Monday. Speaking to the BBC, criminologist Steve Fielding explained the rationale behind the stipulation, stating that it was felt to allow enough time for any new evidence to come to light, the convict to make peace with his or her God, and also to not prolong the inevitable wait to die. At the end of the 20th century, more amendments were made, primarily focusing on who could be sentenced to death. One of the first reforms came with the Children's Act of 1908, which prevented anyone under 16 from being hanged. This would be raised to 18 in 1933, although records are vague with the ages of those condemned to death not being recorded. It is believed that the last execution of anyone under 18 occurred in the late 1800s, with most being sentenced to death but receiving leniency. Over the next 20 years, many of the reforms were centred on female convicts, with the introduction of the Infanticide Act of 1922, which was designed to prevent the execution of a woman who had taken the life of her newborn baby. It was believed that in these circumstances, the mind had been affected by childbirth. This act would be amended in 1938, with the age of the child being specified as being less than 12 months old. As with the previous amendments, this change was effectively eliminating an all but redundant sentence, as the last woman to be executed for infanticide was Rebecca Smith in August 1849. She was convicted of poisoning her 1-month-old son with arsenic. Yet just before her execution, Rebecca would confess to killing 7 other children in the same manner. It would emerge that during her 28 years of marriage, she had been physically and sexually assaulted by her alcoholic husband, with whom she had a total of 11 children, yet these circumstances were not enough to save her from the gallows. Following the execution of Rebecca Smith, there would be 39 women sentenced to death for infanticide. However, each of them would receive a reprieve. Another aspect that affected female convicts was whether they were with child, a situation which could result in them pleading the belly, effectively postponing their execution until after the baby was delivered. The determination regarding whether the woman was pregnant was made by the trial jury, yet before 1919 women were not allowed to have such a position, and thus a group of women, known as a jury of matrons, was formed, and they would examine the prisoner with the aim of discovering whether there was any fetal movement. This practice would change, with later juries making the decision based on reports provided by doctors. If the woman was deemed to be pregnant, the law would not allow an execution, as the unborn child had not committed a crime, but shortly after birth the baby was taken from the mother, whose sentence would then be carried out. In 1931 the Expectant Mothers Act was introduced, which prevented the execution of women after childbirth. Instead, they were sentenced to a prison term, often with hard labour. The argument for this amendment reflected the one for infanticide, in that a judge would be forced to order the guilty person's death, which was the only sentence available by law, only for clemency to be shown later. This was deemed to be a farcical exercise, as the last woman to be executed after giving birth was Mary Ann Cotton in 1873, who was alleged to have poisoned 21 people, including her own children and husband. Yet in the years since, other women who were pregnant at the time of conviction had their sentences commuted. Each new amendment had consequences, in that each reform reduced the number of people eligible to hang, and as the 20th century progressed, an increasing number of individuals who would have been executed were granted reprieves. There was also a change in people's attitude towards the death penalty. Although it had always had its detractors, some controversial cases brought the issue to the forefront of the public consciousness. One which is often listed is the 1923 case of Edith Thompson, who became the first woman to be hanged in England since 1907, which was seen by many to be unseemly. Aside from her gender, issues would arise regarding whether her sentence was just, and speculation that her execution was botched added to the outrage surrounding her death. On the 3rd of October 1922, Edith and her husband Percy were heading home from a night out at the theatre. The couple had just exited Ilford train station and began making their way along the dimly lit streets towards their home, when they were accosted by a shadowy figure. During the attack, Percy collapsed to the floor and the assailant fled, leaving a distraught Edith to scream for help. Post-mortem would reveal that her husband had been stabbed 3 times, with it being determined that any of the wounds would have proved fatal. Percy's killer was identified as Freddie Bywaters, a 20-year-old who worked on a cruise ship, but he was not some random stranger, but a man who was known to the couple. He had courted Edith's younger sister and accompanied the Thompsons on holidays, and when he was not at sea, he was their lodger. Upon a search of Freddie's cabin on the ship, police discovered roughly 62 letters which cast a new light on his relationship with Edith Thompson. The correspondences revealed that far from being happily married, Edith had been living a miserable life with Percy, who had physically assaulted her on at least one occasion. The intimate and romantic nature of the letters also disclosed that Edith had found love in the arms of Freddie, and that she harboured a desire to no longer be married, and spoke of the death of her husband, and the means by which she had fantasized about poisoning his tea, or placing ground glass in his food. Given the content of these notes, questions arose regarding whether Edith was an innocent bystander, or had she conspired with Freddie in order to bring about her husband's death, perhaps to start a new life with her lover, with there being implications that she intended to profit from Percy's life insurance. Freddie would confess to committing the murder, with him stating, "I waited for Mrs. Thompson and her husband. I pushed her to one side, also pushing him into the street. We struggled. I took my knife from my pocket and we fought. He got the worst of it. The reason I fought with Thompson was because he never acted like a man to his wife. He always seemed several degrees lower than a snake. I loved her, and I could not go on seeing her leading that life. I did not intend to kill him. I only meant to injure him. I gave him the opportunity of standing up to me like a man, but he wouldn't." Alongside this admission, Freddie was also linked to the murder weapon, and as such the case against the 20-year-old seemed straightforward. Yet the only evidence of Edith's guilt were the letters written by a woman obsessed with romance novels, who had found herself trapped in a loveless marriage from which she had longed to escape. Despite her discussing her husband's demise, there was nothing in her letters to imply that she had participated in a plot to kill him, nor did Freddie implicate her, insisting till the day of his execution that Edith was innocent. In the press, Edith would be painted as an adulterous woman who had neglected her duties as a wife by choosing to continue working after marriage. Incidentally, she earned more than Percy, but she had failed to provide her husband with children. What was not disclosed until after the trial was that amongst the many letters was one in which Edith spoke of a miscarriage and an abortion, yet these were deemed irrelevant in the case. Much to the dismay of her defence team, it was ruled that Edith and Freddie would be tried together for the murder, and despite efforts to prevent the love letters from being used as evidence, the judge allowed for them to be submitted, although he would rule out some of them due to their explicit content. Less than half of the 62 letters would be presented in court. Most of them benefited the Crown's portrayal of Edith as an immoral woman who was not only unfaithful, but had spoken of the death of her husband on multiple occasions. While the prosecution presented Edith as an adulteress, they also cast aspersions on Freddie's character by calling him out for lying on numerous occasions, which was a fair challenge, as he did lie, but many argued that he did so to protect Edith. There was little doubt that Freddie had murdered Percy, with him claiming he had done so to free Edith from a marriage to a man who did not treat her well. Yet the question of his lover's guilt was more complicated. Yes, she had spoken of her husband's death, but had she truly intended to kill him? Or had her letters been fantastical imaginings, drawing inspiration from the novels she had read? Apart from the letters and the affair, there was very little to suggest that Edith had been complicit in her husband's murder. Yet despite this, both she and Freddie Bywaters would be found guilty, with some believing that negative opinions regarding Edith's character and morals had unfairly influenced the jury's decision. The circumstances surrounding the case and the verdict would be mirrored during the Derek Bentley trial. In each case, neither Derek nor Edith wielded the murder weapon, yet it was concluded that they had compelled the other party to act, with Bentley uttering the infamous words, "Let him have it, Chris," and Edith writing the letters which revealed her desire for her husband to die. The verdicts in both Derek's and Edith's cases would come to be seen as being amongst the worst miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Despite not wielding the knife and the lack of concrete evidence against her, Edith Thompson would not be reprieved, and she would be the first woman to be hanged in 15 years. Even her execution would prove controversial, from the hysterical state of the prisoner prior to her going to the scaffold, to rumours that her death did not go as planned. Freddie and Edith were executed on the 9th of January 1923, with the former meeting his death in Pentonville Prison at the hands of William Willis, while Edith's execution would be carried out by John Ellis, who would later recall the frenzied state she was in, quote, "Mrs. Thompson was in a state of complete emotional collapse, and had absolutely lost all control of herself." He continued by reflecting on how her behaviour affected him, with him stating, "My own feelings defy description. The woman's cries and semi-demented body movements almost unnerved me, but I told myself that my only humane course was to work swiftly and cut Mrs. Thompson's agony as short as possible. So pulling myself together, I quickly pinioned her hands behind her back. By this time the poor woman's cries were being blotted out by the unconsciousness which now mercifully descended upon her, and from which she never again emerged." John Ellis proceeded to describe how the unconscious woman was lifted up by 4 men, while her legs were strapped, and then her limp body was carried to the scaffold, with him recalling that she looked as if she was already dead. "As soon as they reached the trapdoor, I put the white cap on her head and face, and slipped the noose over all. It was a pitiable thing to see the woman being held up on her feet by 4 men. Her head had fallen forward on her breast. She was utterly oblivious of all that was going on. I sprang to the lever, one flick of the wrist, and Mrs. Thompson disappeared from view." Within hours of the execution notice being placed at the gates of Holloway Prison, speculation began to spread regarding what had occurred, with it being suggested that, quote, "her insides fell out." This claim had led to theories over the years, including the possibility that Edith had been pregnant when she was hanged, and the drop through the trapdoor had induced a miscarriage. The notion that she may have been with child came from the reports by the governor of Holloway at the time, who had recorded that Edith had experienced headaches, bouts of constipation, and it was noted that despite a loss of appetite while awaiting her execution, Edith had gained weight. Others, however, believed that the force of the drop had caused her to suffer an internal hemorrhage. However, none of these speculations could be confirmed because a post-mortem was not carried out. What does add credibility to claims that something untoward occurred is that following Edith's execution, it became standard practice that women were issued specially designed underwear which was to be worn during the hanging. 7 years after Edith's execution, the 1930 Select Committee on Capital Punishment was formed, and although the death penalty had been the source of various political debates during its history, leading to many of the changes detailed previously in this episode, this would be the first major one to occur in the 20th century. The committee was tasked to determine whether there could be another form of sentence given in place of the death penalty. This inquiry would consider various aspects, taking into consideration the methods of execution used in other countries, and how some had enacted its abolition, and what had replaced it. The review would utilise historical opinions from previous debates, and those of current political, judicial, and theological backgrounds. with the committee taking into account the primary arguments for and against capital punishment. Those who argued for the death penalty did so for many reasons, including the argument that it acted as a deterrent. However, evidence provided to the committee would counter this position with data from other countries where capital punishment had been abolished temporarily or altogether, showing that crime rates were either higher when it was active or that its reintroduction had little impact in reducing criminality. It was also pointed out that crime rates can fluctuate from year to year, and the reasons for this can be varied and complex, with social, political and economical factors potentially playing a role. Further issues regarding how effective capital punishment was as a deterrent would be the argument that even with the threat of death, murders still occurred, a sentiment echoed later by Albert Pierrepoint, who felt that despite every execution he carried out, he had not once prevented a murder. The committee also determined that while the argument that it acts as a deterrent is a valid one, the true effectiveness of capital punishment is difficult to measure, as it is impossible to determine how many people had been discouraged from committing a crime due to the threat of death. There was the view that the existence of the death penalty helped to give the public a sense of justice, with it being claimed that without such punishment for severe crimes, there may be a temptation for people to take the law into their own hands. It was also argued that the execution of dangerous and violent criminals permanently removed any risk they could pose to society. Yet there was the alternative view, that executions also stripped a person of the chance to be reformed and potentially released. Naturally, the thought of a murderer being released back into the community raised concerns regarding the risk they posed to the public. This was contested with the argument that strict guidance was in place to prevent the release of the most dangerous criminals, yet this is not completely infallible. To prove this point, reference was made to an American case in which a murderer called Neil Cream had been released after 9 years in prison. Neil came to England, where he committed more murders. The counter-argument to this was presented that there had been no similar case involving someone found guilty in Britain. This was further supported by evidence from the Home Office and wardens from various prisons, stating that killers who had been reprieved and released seldom returned to prison. Witnesses from the Home Office testified that should the death penalty be abolished, the number of prisoners who could not be released would be small, with them estimating that abolition would lead to an additional 300 prisoners over the next 20 years, and the proportion of those who could never be set free would be insignificant. During their investigation, the committee would also encounter the debate regarding what happens when an innocent person is hanged. Although some witnesses who stood before the committee would argue that Britain had stringent measures in place to ensure that this was impossible, others would state that no system is infallible and death is irreversible. Another aspect that was raised focused on the severity of the punishment, with critics deeming executions to be unnecessarily harsh and barbaric, with questions raised as to whether there was a more humane alternative. With regards to the human side of the death penalty, consideration had also been given to the impact it had on those connected to the case, from the loved ones of both the victim and the perpetrator, to the jury who had to come to a verdict knowing that they could be condemning someone to death. There were also those who had to attend the hanging, prison staff, and the executioner, and how witnessing such an act may affect them. For the supporters of the death penalty, it could be seen as bringing a sense of justice for the victim and closure for their loved ones. Question was posed that, although it may seem like a just punishment, does the death penalty also penalise the loved ones of the guilty party? Not only are they forced to come to terms with the deeds of the condemned, but they also have to face the grief of losing their loved one too. This also led to the question whether the eye for an eye argument in defence of capital punishment was a justifiable one, or whether it was an archaic defence for a barbaric act that had no place in modern society. With the counter-argument being presented, all life is precious and only God has the right to give and take it. The biblical argument that thou shalt not kill is supported by law, which finds murder to be a criminal deed, with the committee hearing from people who found it to be a strange contradiction that the state is allowed to kill someone for taking another person's life. Another concern that was raised regarding capital punishment revolved around the emotions that can be elicited. I've already discussed the effects on those involved in the case, but the committee also voiced fears that the death penalty had the potential to garner sympathy or infamy for the condemned, which would overshadow the severity of their crime and the life of the person they had killed. Unfortunately, even without the death penalty, this fear has become a reality. As I have lamented many times, as hard as I try to cover cases with the victim at the forefront, oftentimes they are reduced to footnotes in what should be their story. In an effort to create a thorough report, the committee would look to other countries for information, in particular drawing on the wealth of information available from the United States of America, which at the time had some of the highest crime rates in the world. Reviewing the country's relationship with capital punishment provided a detailed tapestry of how each state approached the death penalty, some utilising it, others having abolished it temporarily, while there were those who had completely removed its use. Amongst those who had momentarily abolished the practice were Colorado, Maine and Arizona. The latter would have a period of 2 years between 1916 and 1918, where the death penalty had been removed. Yet when the data was compared with the years during which capital punishment was in effect, reports showed it did not prevent the increasing trend in murders. Like Arizona, Colorado would also see a brief hold on executions, dating from 1898 till 1901. The rationale for its reinstatement was that there was a belief that the public had taken the law into their own hands, with free lynchings taking place in 1900, and it was feared this would become an escalating problem. However, figures suggested that lynchings were more prevalent while capital punishment was in place, with 14 occurring between 1890 and 1895, while half this number occurred during its suspension. Maine temporarily abolished capital punishment in 1876, yet the murder of a guard committed by an insane convict prompted its reinstatement in 1882. However, after it was brought back into use, the state governor noted, quote, there had been an unusual number of cold-blooded murders within the state during the 2 years past. Aside from the view that the death penalty had failed to act as a deterrent, further animosity towards it was caused when a man, who was widely believed to have been innocent, was hanged. The loss of another innocent life was deemed too great a risk to allow capital punishment to continue, and the state abolished it in 1887. While Michigan became the first state to abolish the death penalty in 1846, it was soon joined by Wisconsin in 1953, with the committee being informed that the reasoning was on theological grounds, with it being, quote, at the request of the religious bodies of the state, headed by the Quakers. The committee would also look at other countries, including Italy, where capital punishment had been abolished in 1890, and since its termination, homicide rates had been high, but the numbers were in decline. It was believed that one reason for this trend was the view that the threat of a lengthy prison term, ranging from 21 years to life, acted as a deterrent, although it was argued that this was only one of many complex reasons for the downturn in serious crime, with factors such as better social situations and more effective law enforcement being cited as just 2 of many possible explanations. The investigation would also look at alternatives to the death penalty, with longer prison terms or punishments such as solitary confinement being proposed. It would be evidence from the Italian doctor Adrian Dingley that would help shape the committee's views on the use of the latter, with the doctor describing the practice stating, anything more grossly inhumane than that form of punishment with solitary confinement it is difficult to imagine. Very few survive 7 years solitary confinement, either physically or mentally. It produces the most disastrous break-up and devastation of mind that you can conceive. It has been described commonly as burial for life. End quote. When it came to making their own recommendations based on other forms of punishment, the committee stood by the idea that the alternative to capital punishment should remain as life imprisonment. They did not recommend any additional pains or penalties, disregarding the consideration that murderers should suffer corporal punishment while imprisoned. They also recommended that life should not mean there is no hope of release. if the person is deemed to have been reformed and does not pose a threat to the public, which was in line with what was already in place. Turning their attention to countries that had discarded capital punishment, the committee reviewed the situation in Sri Lanka, which until 1948 was a British colony. However, the country's Legislative Council had voted to abolish capital punishment on the 2nd of February 1928. The reason for this decision was in response to a number of issues with the death penalty that had been echoed by its dissenters in Britain throughout its history. Sri Lanka had found that securing strong evidence to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt was difficult, and they noted there had been instances of perjury to prevent an individual from being put to death. Yet the two main reasons that swayed things towards abolition was that death was final, meaning any miscarriage of justice was irreversible. One of the primary objections to capital punishment came down to religious convictions, with the dominant faith being Buddhism, for whom the act of taking a life directly or indirectly went against their principles, leading to many refusing to serve on juries, declaring themselves as conscientious objectors. Looking closer to home, the committee would also address concerns relating to the use of the insanity plea, with Lord Darling implying that juries, when given an option to find an individual guilty but insane, with perhaps some sort of epilepsy being cited as an example, had been known to find someone insane, with him going on to allege, quote, that there are several people in the asylums who are as sane as the judge who tried them. The bulk of the criticism fell on the McNaughton rule, which stipulated that, quote, to establish a defence on the grounds of insanity, it must be clearly proved that at the time of committing the act, the accused was labouring under such defect of reason, from disease of the mind, as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or, if he did know it, that he did not know he was doing what was wrong. The Medico-Psychological Association of Great Britain and Ireland suggested that this was outdated, with them claiming, quote, unsoundness of mind is no longer regarded as in essence a disorder of the intellectual or cognitive faculties. The modern view is that it is something much more profoundly related to the whole organism, a morbid change in the emotional and instinctive activities, with or without intellectual derangement. They proceeded to conclude that the legal criteria of responsibility set out by the McNaughton rule should be repealed, with the question of a prisoner's sanity being decided based on the merits of the evidence provided in court for the individual case. They also argued that insanity and irresponsibility are coextensive, and they virtually gave immunity to everyone who can be said to be of unsound mind in the broad conception of the term. The association went on to recommend that the law should be retained, yet with amendments. They proceeded to state that it should not be considered a criminal act if the accused does not comprehend that their actions were wrong, but they were not in control of their actions, or did not appreciate the severity of their actions. The committee accepted the position of the British and Ireland Medical Association, and recommended amendments accordingly. Having considered the psychological aspects, the committee also addressed the concerns regarding whether women should be exempt from the death penalty. They would conclude that such punishment should not be determined by gender, but should be considered on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the severity of the crime. They would also reflect on the causes of criminality, with the suggestion that, quote, if crime is largely the product of social conditions, it follows that an improvement in social conditions would reduce the number of murders and other crimes. Therefore, everything that makes for the elimination of poverty, for greater sobriety, for improved housing, and for the purity and honour of the home will decrease murder and every form of crime. Social advance will prove the best deterrent of all. At the conclusion of the report, alongside previously mentioned recommendations, the committee also suggested there be a temporary suspension of the death penalty of 5 years, which would be sufficient time to assess the viability of capital punishment and whether it should be abolished. Yet despite the committee's painstaking efforts to create a thorough report, their recommendations would not be debated in Parliament, and no further action would be taken until 1948, when the Criminal Justice Bill was debated. Utilising many of the points raised by their predecessors, the bill would be brought into law, with it being, quote, an act to abolish penal servitude, hard labour, prison divisions, and sentence of whipping, to amend the law relating to the probation of offenders, and otherwise to reform existing methods, and provide new methods of dealing with offenders and persons liable to imprisonment, to amend the law relating to the proceedings of criminal courts, including the law relating to evidence before such courts, to abolish privilege of peerage in criminal proceedings, to regulate the management of prisons and other institutions, and that treatment of offenders and other persons committed to custody, to re-enact certain enactments relating to the matters aforesaid, and for purposes connected therewith. This act presented one major setback to those who supported the abolition of the death penalty, who had campaigned to have its cessation within the bill. But despite achieving a temporary hold on executions between February and November of 1948, the clause regarding the abolition of the death penalty would be removed before the act was passed. By the following year, another group would be formed, known as the Royal Commission on Capital Punishment, which, like the Committee of 1930, were tasked to investigate whether the death penalty should be limited or modified. At this time it would take 5 years for the inquiry to be completed, during which they would question various people regarding the issues, including judiciary personnel, religious figures, and Albert Pierrepoint, whose testimony included an enactment of an execution. In 1953 the Royal Commission published their report, yet no changes would be implemented until the introduction of the Homicide Act of 1957, which redefined what was considered a capital crime. It limited the death penalty to just 5 offences, which were murder in the course of furtherance of theft, murder by shooting or by causing an explosion, murder in the course or the purpose of resisting, avoiding, or preventing a lawful arrest, or of effecting or assisting an escape or rescue from legal custody, murder of a police officer acting in the execution of his duty, or murder of a prison officer acting in the execution of their duty. The new act was seen as problematic for a number of reasons, the first being its exclusion of murder in the course of rape, which most would argue is one of the most horrific crimes that can be committed, yet it had been deemed as less severe than murder during theft. This oversight was not the only issue. Although the bill did not address abolition, by limiting capital crimes it had inadvertently created a situation in which the end of capital punishment was all but inevitable. With more reprieves, fewer executions, and public sentiment towards the death penalty being increasingly negative, capital punishment would be abolished temporarily in 1965, with the introduction of the Murder Act, with the suspension being made permanent in 1969. For all crimes except arson in royal dockyards, which was removed in 1971, while treason and acts of piracy with violence were commuted to life sentences in 1998, ending capital punishment in the UK. Between 1957 and 1964, judges were still passing the sentence of death, yet the majority of these cases would result in leniency, with a guilty party having their sentence commuted to life. So scarce were executions near the end of this period that in 1963 there were only 2 hangings, while the following year would see the same number, as partners in crime, Peter Allen and Gwynne Evans, were hanged simultaneously at 8 a.m. on August 13, 1964. These executions would not draw much attention. Not only were people unaware that this was a historical moment, but the crime itself had not been deemed newsworthy, with the perpetrators apprehended swiftly and the details of the case lacking the sensational angle that sells papers. It has been suggested that if capital punishment hadn't ceased, their names and crime would have long been forgotten. The 2 men had only become acquainted the previous year, when Gwynne Evans moved in with Peter as a lodger. Both men had been leading similar lives, marked with an inability to maintain a job and petty crime. At 21 years old, Peter was the youngest of the pair, although his large 6'2" frame made him the more physically imposing. He was born on the 4th of April 1943 in Wallasey, Cheshire. Leading a normal childhood, he left school at 15 and soon proved himself incapable of staying in employment, losing 2 jobs just a month after his studies had ended, while a third job as a pipe cleaner only lasted 3 months. He would fare slightly better when he enlisted in the army in July 1958. Serving as a junior gunner, he would be discharged after 11 months, on good terms, with his dismissal being down to his services no longer being required. Having left the army with positive recommendations, Allen secured work as a truck driver, yet in August 1960 he would have his first brush with the law, when he was convicted of aiding and abetting the taking of a car. Due to this being his first offence and the minor nature of the crime, he was granted a conditional discharge. By October 1961, Peter found himself unemployed once more, this time with it being determined that he was not capable of managing the responsibilities that had come with a promotion. This blow came less than a month before he was due to marry his fiancée, Mary Hennett, a cinema usherette who went by the name Mitch, which she had tattooed on the fingers of her left hand. The Catholic ceremony would take place on November the 11th, 1961, with the newlyweds taking up residence in Manchester, where Peter secured work as a scrap dealer. Yet 6 months later, he would be fired for tardiness. Over the next 2 years, he would have 2 jobs, one as a dairy worker and another at a steelworks. Yet he didn't last more than 6 months in either role, prompting him and Mary to relocate to Preston, where Peter would work as a labourer. It was in Preston that he would cross paths with Gwynne Evans, who would move into the Allens' home as a lodger, and would start working alongside his landlord as a labourer, until Peter injured his back in June 1963 and was unable to work. 24-year-old Evans was tall and slim with auburn hair that led to him being known as Sandy or Ginger. He was not a stranger to going by an alias. When he was born on the 1st of April 1940, he was given the name John Robson Wolby, which he would change in 1959. For clarity, however, I will continue to refer to him as Gwynne Evans. The son of Thomas and Hannah, he was born in the Cumberland harbour town of Maryport, where he was raised in the Catholic faith. Being a member of the local church choir and the Boy Scouts, he had been provided with a strong moral foundation by his parents. But Gwynne had started to demonstrate disturbing behaviour. He was described as being, quote, untrustworthy, lacked moral sense, was untruthful, and inclined to steal. Due to his unnerving behaviour, Gwynne was sent to Dovenby Hall, a beautiful manor house set in 115 acres of land, which included manicured gardens, open fields and woodlands. In the 1930s, the hall had been acquired and transformed into a home for people deemed to be, quote, mentally defective. Dovenby Hall was one of many institutions in Britain, known as colonies, that became prevalent in the years between the First and Second World War. They were presented as a place where people who suffered from various mental disorders could live independently, while being given access to enrichment such as education and workshops, from which they could acquire new skills, while also receiving medical treatment. These facilities often came with their own kitchens, laundries, shops, and a space to host dances and other entertainment, with the layout being such that the genders were housed separately, and the accommodation was segregated according to the severity of a person's disorder. In retrospect, these institutions would be criticised as being a means of separating the mentally ill from society, with some patients living most of their lives in these settings. Gwynne, however, would not have this experience, and by the age of 15 he was no longer a patient at Dovenby Hall, and had finished his formal education. Like Peter, Evans would also struggle to hold down a job, working as a hotel porter and a train engine cleaner, but these would not last long. And amidst a period of unemployment, at the age of 17, Evans was placed under a supervision order, effectively putting him in the care of the state. Part of the order involved the teenager being housed in a hostel in Bristol, nearly 300 miles south of his hometown. It was while here that Evans tried to enlist in the army, but concerns were raised regarding his state of mind, with it being alleged he was often untruthful, but seemed to believe his own lies. After a medical assessment, it was concluded that Evans was, quote, unfit under existing standards, resulting in him being discharged. Within months, he attempted to enlist with a different regiment, but having served 3 months, he was discharged in February 1959, due to a, quote, personality inadequacy. His commanding officer elaborated on this further, stating that Evans is a failure. He cannot make friends because of feeling superior and telling complete fairy tales all the time. Seemingly determined to be a soldier, he would discard his birth name of John Robson Walby, opting to go by the name Owen Evans, under which he applied and was accepted into the Royal Air Force in July 1959. But he once again was deemed unfit for service due to nervous instability, and he was discharged from the armed forces in November 1959. Unable to pursue his goal, Owen returned to his hometown of Maryport, and over the next few years he would flit from one job to the next, living in different parts of the country, while also accumulating a criminal record. These included theft and obtaining items under false pretences, for which he was issued a £5 fine. Unable to pay, he was imprisoned for 4 days. No one seemed to be off limits from his acts of larceny and dishonesty. He would steal money from a friend and, in a more daring move, managed to acquire a loan from a police station by claiming he had lost his wallet while attending his mother's funeral. In May of 1963, Evans would spend 3 months in prison for the theft of a motor vehicle while driving without a valid licence. It appears he presented officers with a forged document upon his arrest. With Evans proving himself to be untrustworthy, it is not surprising that when he attempted to join the army for the 4th and final time in October of 1963, he was let go within a month for not disclosing his criminal record. Moving into the Preston home of Peter and Mary Allen in 1963 would not change Evans. Instead, he found a kindred spirit in Peter, while it was alleged he was conducting an affair with Mary. By 1964, both men were unemployed and had begun their criminal partnership, carrying out numerous robberies, starting with a seemingly petty crime of pilfering the contents of a cigarette machine. Yet this would escalate, with them stealing vehicles to use in burglaries. However, when the pair attempted to conceal the number plate of a stolen van, they were arrested and each fined £10, roughly £160 today. This proved problematic for 2 unemployed men with no money, especially for Peter, who now had 2 young children. Their inability to pay the fine proved to be the instigating factor in what ultimately led to their demise. The pair devised a plan to target a former co-worker of Gwynne's, whom he had met while working at Lakeland Laundry in September of 1961. Unlike the dishonest duo, who seemed incapable of holding down a job, John West, known to friends as Jack, was a conscientious and reliable employee, who had worked as a van driver for the Lakeland Laundry Company for 35 years. At 53 years old, John had never married, and was living alone in a 3-bedroom semi-detached house he had shared with his mother until her death. The house was the last house on a dead-end street, and was bordered on one side by open fields. The area of Workington itself was described by the Liverpool Echo as a seedy place, which was avoided by tourists to the Lake District because it was a decayed and desolate location dominated by steelworks and coal mines. However, for John it was home, and he seemed content to reside in the town, enjoying his hobbies including cars, gardening, and playing darts at the only pub in town, where he was a regular. John was known locally as a quiet and calm man, who would politely exchange pleasantries with people, but seemed to enjoy his own company. While some were ambivalent towards him, others saw John as strange, primarily because they deemed it unusual for a man in his 50s to be unmarried and living alone. This in turn led to unfounded speculation regarding his sexuality. If there were any truth in these rumours, it is likely that John would have concealed it, as same-sex relations between men was illegal at the time. For Peter and Gwynne, John's solitary lifestyle combined with the pair's belief that the 53-year-old had money and valuables at his property made him the ideal target, and on the 7th of April 1964 they carried out their plot. Stealing a car from outside a pub in Preston, they set off on the 100-mile trip to John's home, making the first of many unusual decisions. They opted to take Mary and her 2 children, the oldest of whom was just 3 years old, along with them. They arrived at John's home just after 1 a.m. on the 7th of April, and while Mary and the children were asleep in the back seat, the 2 men exited the vehicle. They approached the door, which was located at the side of the property, with it opening out on the farmland beyond, limiting the chances of being seen by witnesses. At roughly 3 a.m, loud noises were heard by John's neighbour, Joseph Fawcett, who, peering outside, was just able to catch sight of a car exiting the street. Suspicious and concerned for his neighbour, Joseph, accompanied by another resident from the street, approached John's property. The door was locked, and they received no response to their knocking. With no noise from within and unable to gain access to the home, the police were summoned. When Sergeant James Park and Constable John Rogers arrived at the scene, they forced entry into the property. Discovering John's motionless body lying at the bottom of the stairs, with Sergeant Park recording, there was a large amount of blood on the floor, and the man was obviously dead. Not far from the body was a homemade cosh, coated in blood, which was determined to have been used in the attack. A subsequent post-mortem would reveal how vicious the attack on the 53-year-old had been. He had multiple bruises to his face and body, as well as a cut to his head, with signs of trauma to the brain. John had also been stabbed in the chest, with the blade penetrating the left ventricle of the heart. Reviewing the injuries, Dr. Folds concluded that, quote, death resulted from hemorrhage and shock, caused by a stab wound into the heart and multiple head injuries. Given the brutal nature of the attack, the police knew it was imperative to apprehend the responsible party swiftly, with the first task being to look for evidence in John's home that could point to a potential motive, and perhaps provide clues to the killer's identity. The lack of signs of forced entry suggested that John may have known his attacker, and he had voluntarily let them in. With regards to the motive, signs that the property had been ransacked hinted at robbery, while a raincoat, which did not seem to be something John would wear, was also found. Some reports state that it was draped over the banister, while others suggest it was in John's bedroom. Regardless of its location, the raincoat proved to be the breakthrough investigators needed. Within the pockets was a medallion, inscribed with the initials G.O. Evans and the date July 1961, along with a piece of paper with a name and address written on it. Officers were swiftly dispatched to the address in Liverpool, where they found 17-year-old Nora O'Brien. Not only could she identify the medallion, she named its owner as Gwynne Evans, and gave the police an address where they could find him. The net was closing in on the perpetrators, who after the murder had driven south. Mary had insisted on knowing what had happened after seeing blood on her husband's shirt. If she had been shocked or disgusted by what she was told, she had no choice but to remain with the pair, being that she was so far away from home, and her 2 children were with them. As the car sped through the Lake District, they briefly stopped at the shores of Windermere, where they discarded of the knife used to stab John. Bizarrely, they would also pick up a lamb which they found straying on the road. This was later taken to the RSPCA. They then headed to Ormskirk, which lies just north of Liverpool, where they left the car at the home belonging to a friend of Peter's, who, after hearing about the crime, would report it to the police. During the robbery, the men had taken 2 of John's banking books, which they proceeded to use when they reached Liverpool, with Mary joining Evans as they went into the bank to withdraw £10 from the deceased man's account. Having obtained these funds, the pair, accompanied by Mary and the children, made their way back to Preston, unaware that the police would soon catch up to them. And so it was that on Wednesday, the 8th of April, officers arrived at the home in Preston. Although they would only find Peter Allen at the address, he was taken in for questioning, during which he alleged he had been with Mary and Evans in their Preston home on the night John West had been killed. Wishing to corroborate this claim, the police tracked Mary down to her mother's house in Manchester. and Peter's wife willingly provided them with the location of Evans, who was also in the city. Gwynne Evans was apprehended, and during a search of his person he was found to be in possession of a 17-carat gold wristwatch. Although somebody had attempted to destroy it, there was an engraving on the back which connected the watch to John West, as it had been a gift to honour his long service at the laundry company. Upon being taken into the police station, Evans was asked to confirm his identity, with him stating that his real name was John Robson Wolby, but he had changed it after, quote, "I found out I was born in Innsbruck in 1940, and that both my parents were German." Starting his police statement with a lie did not bode well for the rest of his interrogation, and probably contributed towards the detective's belief that Peter Allen's statements were the more credible. Not long into his questioning, Evans admitted that he had been in John West's home on the night of the murder, and also implicated Peter Allen, whom he claimed was the one who murdered the 53-year-old. He told detectives that he used to work with John, whom he called Jack, and that he had told Evans that should he ever need anything, he would be happy to help. It was this offer that had prompted Evans to visit John that night, hoping to secure a loan in order to pay off a court fine. It would be Evans who made the suggestion that John was gay, and that the 53-year-old had wanted to have sex with him that night, but Evans insisted he refused. Given his reputation for lying, how truthful this claim was will never be known. Detailing what led to the murder, Evans alleged that he had entered the home first, stating, quote, "I was going to ask him for £100, and told him I had a friend in the car outside," adding, "I had some tea and a cheese bun, and as we were talking there was a knock at the door. I honestly didn't know who it was. Anyway, Jack went to the door." Evans proceeded by claiming that Peter forced his way into the house, and caused such a commotion that he left the kitchen to see what was happening. "I went into the hall, and I saw Peter hitting Jack with something that looked like a pipe. He had him up against the wall, and there was a lot of blood." The 24-year-old did admit that he stole the watch, which he had previously claimed he had purchased just before his arrest. But he went on to deny knowing anything about a knife that had been used in the attack. Quote, "I don't know anything about a knife. I don't have to use a knife to kill a man. I am an expert in judo and karate. I never hit Jack. It was Peter that did all the hitting." The problem with this statement, apart from the fact that he had lied about being a martial arts expert, was that the police had not yet mentioned the manner in which John had died, making it a detail only the police and the killer would know. Yet Evans would continue to insist that although he stole from West's home, he did not hurt him. Close to the end of his statement, he said he realised he had left his coat at the crime scene, and, quote, "If I wanted, I could have said that my coat had been stolen and my keys were in it, and no judge in the country would convict me. But I am glad to have got it off my chest." While Evans was being interviewed in Manchester, his partner in crime was under interrogation in Preston, where he would boldly state, "You can get a stack of Bibles in here and I'll stand on them and swear I know nothing about it." His confidence quickly waned, however, and just moments after making this statement, he hit his fist on the table and laid his head in his arm, before looking at Detective Superintendent Roberts and saying, "All right, I'll tell you. I'd like to tell the whole flipping world about it." Allen would claim that Gwynne was to gain access to West's property and then let Peter in, but claimed that West, who had been in the bedroom, caught them, and things had turned violent. Allen admitted to attacking the 53-year-old, and that Gwynne had given him the cosh. But then he changed his account, alleging that it was Evans who carried out the violent assault. Comparing the two statements to what was discovered at the crime scene, detectives agreed that Evans had likely gained access to the property first. However, given that John was found with no trousers on and his false teeth were found at the top of the stairs, officers believed the 53-year-old had been upstairs and Evans had let Allen in to the home, with them theorising that John would not have left Allen in the kitchen to answer the door in a state of semi-nakedness. Mary would corroborate the conclusion that Evans had entered the home first, with her stating that when she had asked them what had occurred, they both claimed to have assaulted John, with them alleging that West had struck Peter first, and he had retaliated, and Evans had subsequently joined in. After the two men were formally charged on the 9th of April, Mary would add to her statement, telling police that Evans was the one who disposed of the knife, with her accompanying detectives to where they had stopped, allowing the blade to be recovered. She also recalled that during the drive Evans had stated that he never expected it to go below the alarm clock, with her telling police that he had been referring to where he had stabbed West. However, Mary had made this statement after learning that John had been stabbed during the remand hearing, calling into question whether she had said this to implicate Evans and protect her husband. While the two men awaited trial, both would be observed by doctors. While at Durham Prison, Evans was assessed by Dr. Waddington, the prison's senior medical officer, who would compile a report based on Evans's medical records and observations of his behaviour while in the prison. The doctor recorded that Evans, until the age of 15, had been in Dovenby Hall, due to a lack of morals, inability to differentiate between right and wrong, and his tendencies to lie, adding that these traits continued into adulthood, with Evans being a fantasist who believed the lies he told, and he did so in order to make himself appear more interesting. Amongst his many claims included his assertion that he had a German wife and 2 children, which was undoubtedly false. He also alleged that he had worked for a security company where he gained his expertise in martial arts, but on checking he was only at the job for a week. The doctor concluded that Evans had a psychopathic personality, using this term in the broadest sense, but added that he did not believe this was an abnormality of the mind. However, this did stop him from knowing that his actions were wrong. This conclusion was also drawn by Dr. Keane, but neither doctor was able to attribute Evans' behaviour to a particular condition or disease, and they were unable to clarify how they had reached their findings. Although the defence for Gwynne Evans would try to use their assessments to say that he was guilty but insane, they would quickly drop this defence at trial. Peter Allen and Gwynne Evans would stand trial together in Manchester on the 23rd of June 1964. As the pair had committed a murder during robbery, they were facing a capital charge, which was punishable by death. The two men continued to blame each other. Ultimately, the jury of 9 men and 3 women were expected to decide whether just one or both of the defendants were culpable, and after deliberating for nearly 4 hours, they concluded that Peter Allen and Gwynne Evans were jointly responsible for the death of John West, while in the midst of a robbery. Despite being sentenced to death, there were few who believed it would actually happen, given that there had not been an execution in that year, and the year prior had only seen 2. Both men launched appeals, with Evans's lawyers arguing that he suffered from a mental impairment. His own mother would write to the Home Secretary to state that "My son is mentally impaired, and I had him under a mental doctor at the age of 8, but he is not a wicked boy." The appeals failed for both men, with it being reported that, having reviewed all available records and testimonies, medical experts have been unable to find any special circumstances regarding Evans that would save him from the noose, and so no reprise was forthcoming. Of the 2 men, Peter Allen had the most visceral reaction to the news, with him destroying his condemned cell in a violent rage. Referring to the reason why Allen and Evans were not shown leniency, historian and author Steve Fielding suggested, quote, "Whether a man was reprieved or not was quite arbitrary. There were people who committed much more brutal murders who, after being sentenced to execution, were commuted to life sentences. It may even have come down to the fact that a prison hadn't used its gallows for a while. There was no consistency." As dawn broke on Thursday the 13th of August 1964, Peter Allen awoke in his condemned cell in Waltham Jail, in Liverpool, while 36 miles away, his former partner in crime was being held at Strangeways in Manchester, both aware of their impending deaths. Though in separate prisons, they would both follow the same routine as all those condemned to death before them. their arms and legs pinioned by leather straps, a white hood placed over their heads, followed by the rope from which they would hang. And at the stroke of 8 a.m, the trapdoor would spring open and they would plummet into the darkness below. Peter Allen did not go quietly to his death, with him crying for his mother and struggling against his restraints as he was led into the execution chamber. But at the hands of hangman Robert Leslie Stewart, he would join the 62 people executed at Walton Jail since 1887, not knowing that he would be the last. Meanwhile at Strangeways, former apprentice to Albert Pierrepoint, Harry Allen, would carry out the execution of Gwynne Evans. Like his former mentor, Harry was a pub landlord, and he also shared Albert's approach to the role of a hangman. As his predecessor had done, he carried out his duty with solemnity and professionalism, always dressing in black as a mark of respect for the condemned. Since private executions had been implemented, Strangeways Prison had bore witness to the deaths of 99 people at the noose, and as Gwynne Evans went to his death with silent dignity, he became number 100. Evans and Allen may have been the last to be executed, but they were not the last to be sentenced to death, with another 17 men being ordered to hang, yet they would be reprieved, with the last order being given on the 1st of November 1965 to David Chapman, who had been found guilty of murder in the course of a robbery. Just 8 days after his sentencing, the Murder Abolition of Death Penalty Act would be introduced, which caused Chapman to receive a life sentence, with the Act also bringing in the suspension of the death penalty for 5 years, after which it would be permanently abolished for all crimes except arson in royal dockyards, treason and acts of piracy with violence, which were all commuted to life sentences by 1998. I cannot end this series without discussing what happened to the man who inspired it, whose 25-year career saw him executing Nazi war criminals, infamous serial killers, and those found guilty but proven innocent after death. Albert retired as a pub landlord in 1960, with him and his wife Annie moving to the seaside town of Southport. And in 1974 his autobiography, Executioner Pierrepoint, was published, in which he spoke of his ambition to follow in the footsteps of his father and his uncle Tom. And while his memoirs gave a glimpse into both the private and professional life of an executioner, for me his writings had the air of a stereotypical stiff upper lip, with him not entering into moments of emotion. However, he was also not afraid to voice his thoughts about the role he had performed with a sense of duty, although he would later state that his thoughts on the death penalty varied from one day to the next. The same would be true regarding people's opinions of Albert, with some holding him in high esteem, while others see his actions in later life, with him giving interviews, etc., as being those of a man seeking notoriety, while others view his actions as a hangman as being nothing better than the people he was hanging. His recollections of events have also been called into question, with some details not always lining up with the facts, which I found during my research. Yet no one can deny that he has become a part of British history, with his name forever being connected to being the most prolific hangman and one of the country's last. Albert Pierrepoint lived out the remainder of his life in Southport, living in a small bungalow with Annie, until 1988, when he moved into a nursing home where he would spend his final 4 years, passing away on the 10th of July 1992, at the age of 87. I just want to say thank you for joining me for this series. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed listening to it as much as I have enjoyed creating it. The support received from you all is incredible and greatly appreciated. If you like the podcast, please let others know by leaving a review. It's Murder Up North is on YouTube, X formerly Twitter, and there is a Facebook group I would love for you to join. The show will be going on a brief hiatus, just whilst I work on future episodes, but I will keep you updated. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.